How's it going? So today I have a very interesting guest, Lindie Botes, and she's come with us live from Singapore. And today I wanted to talk to her. I mean, she can do a self-introduction in a second, but I think she's learned various languages to a high level, including Korean. I think is probably one of her best, I think, and then also Japanese to quite a high level as well. So I wanted to talk a bit about what that was like, and then maybe a bit about her experience with Chinese as well. So yeah, how are you, Lindie?
Yeah, awesome. Thanks. Yes, thanks for that introduction. I'm doing good. Thanks for having me here. For those of you who don't know me, I am a South African designer working in Singapore, but outside of work, I am just absolutely obsessed with languages. So yeah, Korean and Japanese are my strongest languages. And then after Mandarin Chinese, French, Spanish, and recently restarted Hungarian and Vietnamese, and then dabbling in all kinds of languages here and there, but those are my main ones. And
So
as you might know, go ahead.
So I was going to say, because if you said you're from South Africa, do you speak Afrikaans, right?
Yeah, Afrikaans is my home language.
So does that mean English is technically your second language, or is it kind of like bilingual?
That is such an interesting question because we only speak Afrikaans at home, but I've always ever been at English school. So I think that constitutes as bilingual.
Because you sound, for all intents and purposes, like an English native speaker. So I think that's
I guess so,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay, cool. So when you were learning Mandarin and Japanese, then I'm sorry, Korean and Japanese, did you start with Korean first? Because that's the high one, or was it Japanese first and then?
No, I started with Korean about almost 10 years ago. I think it's been 10 years. And
wow.
It was my first foreign language outside of school. So I had taken Arabic and French at school, and Korean was the first one I self-studied. And that really just opened the doors to exploring other Asian languages like Japanese and Korean and even Cantonese. So I actually started with Cantonese before I started Mandarin, which
wow,
you
same
might
as
find
me.
interesting. Oh yeah, but it's tough. It's so tough. So Korean really kind of took over my life for many, many years. And then my parents moved to Japan, and I was like, well, I got to learn Japanese now. And I just fell so in love with the language and the culture and the design. So I wanted to work in Japan for a bit. So I did my internships there, but somehow I ended up here in Singapore. And as you know, Mandarin Chinese is an official language. So I hear that every day. And even though I don't really actively study Chinese right now, I do hear it a lot. And I'm actually improving through maybe passive
Oh wow,
studying.
cool.
Yeah.
So how long have you been in Singapore for?
It's almost 2 years in February.
Oh wow, that's really nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I'm curious. So what? So you've come into school. You learn Arabic and French in school. Did you say? I think, and then suddenly you decided to go for Korean. So is that? I'm just wondering what was the magnet? Was it like K dramas or maybe K-pop or something?
You would think so, but it is a funny story. So I had quite a few Korean friends when I grew up in Dubai at school. We're quite an international school, and most of my close friends were Korean. But I was never really interested in like exploring the language further than just being able to write my name or saying hello. And when we moved back to South Africa, my mom actually saw an ad in the newspaper for free Korean lessons. And she knew I had a Korean friend, and she was like, "Hey, do you want to like take free Korean lessons with me?" And I was like, okay." And I just thought of it as like, whatever, this is one of my mom's funny ideas. And she studied a lot harder than me. She made flashcards, she watched K-dramas, and I was like, I'll just study in every Saturday, I'll do my homework, and that's it. And then I visited Korea for a holiday at the end of my first or second year of learning Korean, and I was just blown away by the history and the culture and the language. And I was like, well, I'm really going to start focusing on my efforts on improving this. And I actually learned a lot faster than the rest of the class. So I spent a lot more time self-studying, and
But so
eventually
was
my
this when you went to Korea as well? You did class over there, was that sorry? Or
no,
you
I
mean the
came
one that
back
you did
from
with your mum? Was that the same
yeah,
thing still?
yeah, I came back from a month holiday and then continued with the lessons with my mom. But that class kind of fizzled out because most of the students were Taekwondo students
Uh-huh.
who were participating in championships in Korea, and they were only interested in Taekwondo, not Korean. So it was a kind of a weird situation. But then I had the right footing to start self studying.
So then you had the Korean bug, and then you started going.
Oh yeah.
full out with the Korean self-study. So what's
Yeah.
your approach like? What do you normally do?
Yeah. Um, that's a tough question because I think I had a different, a strange footing to start Korean with because I did start with lessons and then kind of continue self-study. Maybe a good example would be like how I started with Japanese,
Okay, sure.
in
So
terms
yeah,
of
let's
maybe
talk about that.
approaching, yeah, how I approach a new language. Um, I'd love to hear your experience too. For me, it was more first learning the very basic greetings and learning how to make very, very simple sentences, but at the same time, learning how to read and write. I put a lot of emphasis on being able to read and write katakana and hiragana at the beginning because I did not want to rely on romanization.
I think that sounds like
And
a good
that,
idea.
yeah, it helps you pronounce things better. It helps you just get on the right footing to start reading and sets a good base for learning kanji later. I know a lot of people have quite elaborate plans of how they approach learning kanji. For me, it was more of what do I encounter a lot? If I've seen this kanji everywhere, I should learn it. So maybe I would like read a very basic article or a passage, and whatever kanji pops up there, I would learn it from there rather than approaching like the top 1000 kanji you need to know because it doesn't really have context
Yeah.
tied to it. What do you think?
Well, I think so. I used the method called the Heisig method when I first started off because I was
Oh,
kind of
yeah.
like sold on the idea. Um,
Yeah.
I haven't really talked about this on my channel, I don't think, before, but I think after I've actually used it, I found it useful at the time. But I think my experience and my opinion has probably changed a lot more recently because, I think the, it's trying to like rush you through the process of learning 1,000 characters or 1,500 characters or whatever the number is, and then the idea is you can know how to write them after that, but you still don't really know what any of them mean. You kind of have to like relearn it after,
Mm,
like how to use them in all the different
right.
contexts. So I definitely think there is a use to it in the way that it helps you gain the ability to break down characters into like the smaller elements, and it
Mm,
turns these like squiggly lines into like characters with meaning, and
yes.
it makes the process of learning characters a lot more digestible into like manageable steps that you can, okay, well, I'll do A and then B and then C. And then when
Yeah.
you start, maybe start like texting with your friends or something or doing simple things like that, I find it a lot easier to kind of, well, I don't have an experience of not doing it, but I'd imagine it was easier than if it was starting from complete scratch. Because I'm like, oh, well, that's just it's the character for Japan. It's the word for Japan. Oh, look, it's the character for sun and the character for source. So it's like, oh, it's the land of the rising sun. That's Japan. Okay. And you
Mm,
can like think of stuff
mm,
like that. Um,
mm,
but really, I don't think there's any way to rush it. Like as much as I tried to at the start, I tried to, blast through that book, and then years later and still like forgot half of them because I haven't doing Anki reps or anything, but I'm still kind of learning new ones today and things. So I think you can't really rush it. I think it's just whatever makes it okay to break it down into manageable steps that you can digest, and then just reading as much as you physically can.
yeah, and everyone has a different process. I think if I heard correctly, you mentioned Anki, but that works for some people and it just doesn't work for other people. And I think language learners spend a lot of time trying to figure out what is the most effective or best way to learn a language. And I think it would be more beneficial just to try, start with whatever feels normal and comfortable for
Mm.
you. If that doesn't work out, sure, change it. But sometimes I feel like we waste time trying to figure out what's the best way when there really are so many ways.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I haven't actually used Anki in a very, very long time now. I think I was the same. I was like trying to like research what is the one best method, and loads of people, suggested Anki, and it has its uses, but I find it so like boring.
Oh
So
my goodness, same.
mm. So now I'm just like, you know what? I'm just gonna try and read and watch as much stuff as I can. If it
Yeah,
sticks, it sticks. If I forget it, I'll
exactly.
run into it some other day and just
Yeah, and
keep going.
that's such a natural method of learning as well. I mean, that's how we learn our home languages. And even in English now, there is a ton of words I still don't know. And it's only
Yeah,
by
same.
exposing yourself, exactly, exposing yourself to reading and listening that you'll learn what these words mean, rather than like sitting and reading a dictionary trying to just acquire new words like that. It's
Yeah,
not natural.
that's really interesting. I think I agree with what you said about starting with the kana, like the hiragana and the katakana, which I get.
Mhm.
I'm assuming most people who are watching this will be familiar with the sort of the way the Japanese alphabet works, but just in case, it's basically you have two, I'd call them alphabets, but they're more syllabaries, I think.
Mm.
But it's
Yeah.
kind of like how the alphabet works, just with like you've got like 50 odd sounds in each, and you put them together to like spell out phonetically how words sound. And then you've got kanji, which is the ones that come from Chinese, and then Japanese uses all three of them to write
Mm.
stuff. I think hiragana and katakana are about 50 each, and kanji, I think the standard use is a little over 2,000. But if you want to read novels and stuff, you probably need to know a lot more than that. So that's where there's the big discrepancy in how much time it takes to learn one compared to the other, which
Yeah.
is why most people suggest starting with kana, I suppose.
Mm. Mm.
So what did you do after you? So you've got a basis in the kana, you learnt them. How probably was that through like practicing writing them out, or did you like make
Yeah.
flashcards, or how did you learn the kana?
I tried everything. I think I started out by writing out like the tables of the characters. So, kaki kuki ro sachi shisei so, and that got really boring and repetitive for me. So I started by writing out very baby words like kasa or um, gosh, my brain is in Korean mode now, but very, very basic words.
Mhm.
And then the first textbook I started with was Japanese for Busy People, which I will stand firm and say that is the best textbook I've used. It's so old and like random, but
I
the
think
way
I've
they
seen that
introduce,
though. They have the
yeah,
dialogues in kana, right?
yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they have a Romaji version book as well, but I would not want anyone to use that.
Mhm.
But they introduce you feel good when you work through the book because you can understand a basic conversation and imagine yourself having this conversation, and then at the end of the chapter you have the related kanji and the vocabulary that you
Mhm.
read there.
So
So
I've not used the book before. I've heard of it. When I
mm,
was thinking about starting Japanese at one point, I was looking into what book to use, and that was the book that I decided if I learned Japanese, I would actually start with.
good
That's quite a
choice.
weird coincidence.
Yeah, it's a
Just
good
because
one.
it had all the stuff in Kana, and I was like, well, learn the Kana and then got into that anyway. So is there also like exercises and stuff? Did you focus mostly on like the dialogues, on the reading and the listening to the audio tapes, or did you do like all the exercises as well? How did you kind of go through that?
I feel like I did everything at once because a big part of my Japanese learning journey was spent in Japan.
Mhm.
And I would hear the language a lot. And I remember my dad would come home with the Japan Times newspaper, and they had a whole Japan. I actually have it. If you give me 1 second, I might find it and be able to explain better. Let me see if I can find it. So I would take newspaper clippings of Japanese lessons and work through those, and anything I could get my hands on, I tried to transform it into like a language resource. So this is maybe my second notebook from 2013,
Oh
and
well.
I would kind of cut something out from the newspaper there, highlight the dialogue,
Mhm.
rewrite it, and look up the words. So I tried to kind of create these resources for myself.
Oh
Here's
wow.
another like newspaper clipping, and obviously not everyone will have access to the Japan Times to do that, but you know the
I mean,
internet
you
has
have you
so
have the
many.
internet now, yeah.
Exactly. And I would just write down dialogues, things I would hear. Yeah, my notes are very not really organized when I started, but I did repeat sentences a lot. If I find an okay, here's an example. I would just write the same thing over and over and
Mhm.
over in a sense to get my hand used to it and get more like muscle memory when writing kanji, and just to solidify that sentence in my mind. But I also spent a lot of time listening and trying to put myself outside of my comfort zone to speak Japanese as much as possible. And people always ask, like, how can you speak a language that you don't know, that you're not learning? But it's just it's like little baby building blocks. If you know how to say, hi, how are you? How much does this cost? Wonderful, at least you can say something
Mhm.
every day. Use it a little bit more, a little bit more. Whatever you're gaining and acquiring, you can add it to your little building blocks of what you can
Mhm.
say.
It's like what was that quote? First, something's difficult before it's easy.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah,
I really like that. So you kind of found like you had some sort of solid beginner course that's given you like an introduction to the language, but then
that's
very
important.
early on you're kind of like grabbing things from like the real world, whether it's from clippings from newspapers or like things you hear outside or whatever, and really trying to like incorporate. I always say like the language in textbooks is a bit artificial sometimes to incorporate
Oh
like
yeah,
real Japanese
yeah,
into your like study from quite early on, which I think
exactly,
is
exactly.
really really good because I think one thing I've seen a lot of people do, and I would say it's mistake, but I guess it depends on what your goals are and timelines are on things. But people tend to stick with like beginners books for like really, really long time and don't do anything else. So they'd be
Yeah.
like, oh well, Japanese from 0, 1, and then that's 3 months, then 2, and then 3, and then I don't know if there's a 4 or whatever. And then you're talking about like a year into study and you're still like on like beginner 1 or 2 content and
Mm,
not really like pushed much beyond that. So I found it kind of, at least for me, really motivating, just kind of like jump in the deep end and kind of like sink or swim
yeah,
and use something like maybe Link or like a pop-up dictionary or
yeah.
anything to try and like help you fight through the content.
For sure, for sure. Yeah. Jumping in the deep end is fun as well. And I think that comes with the more languages you learn, the more open you are to diving in. And I feel like maybe it's a little bit of a safety net to kind of just stick to a beginner textbook, then move on to the intermediate, really opening yourself up to transforming your world into another language takes a lot of guts. And that just reminded me of like language stacking, because you can speak Chinese, and if you want to learn like Japanese or Korean, you can learn it through Chinese. So this is a textbook I used early on. It's a Korean book for learning Japanese. And because I was already, at a level decent enough to be able to understand this is the textbook I use. So
Oh
they
wow.
have the Korean, I can't even see like this. Oh, okay, there you go. The Korean is right at the bottom there, and then
Mm-hmm.
the Japanese here. And
And
it's
then they've got, what's that? They've got the kanji with like the romaji above it, and then all the
exactly
different.
with the furigana. Yeah. And this is quite a unique book because it's called situational pattern dialogue. So it's like, what if you are at the doctor or shopping or phone calls or relationships with friends, blah blah blah.
Does it
And
have
that is a
audio?
lot. No, it doesn't. That's an important thing. Yeah. But it's a lot more natural. It's like little phrases. And that's also where chunking comes in. It's important to learn small set phrases rather than just try and rope in a whole lot of vocabulary without
Yeah.
knowing how to use the vocab.
Yeah, it's like if you take a simple example in Chinese, if you take eat rice and it means to have dinner, it's like if you look at it in isolation, it doesn't really make that much sense, or at least
Mhm.
it's not the same way they would use it in English. So it's, I
True.
think, with maybe because I don't have much experience learning other European languages, so I feel like maybe it would be less of a problem with something like Spanish or French that's closer to English. But I think with stuff like Korean and Japanese and Chinese, because the way of thinking is so kind of like inherently different,
Mm.
that I mean, maybe more so with Japanese, I'm not sure. That is, you just can't like word by word translate things and expect to understand it in the same way.
That's true. That's true. And maybe that's why Japanese was not a massive struggle for me, because I had the base in Korean, and
Mm-hmm.
Japanese and Korean sentence structure are very similar. Where I'm having a challenge now is with Chinese, because that's so different from, people don't actually realize how different Chinese is from Japanese. You
Mm-hmm.
you think, oh, okay, it has the kanji connection. It's both like a difficult Asian language, but the sentence structure is completely different, and the grammar
I
is
think the
very,
sentence
very
structure is
different.
probably closest to English from what I understand, because it's both
Yes,
SVO.
yes. Yeah, exactly.
What
Yeah.
about cognates between Korean and, because when I was in class, we had students from like all over. So I was from England, and then I had students from Korea, like Vietnam and Japan, and they always
Mhm.
found that like the Japanese students really excelled at reading and writing, which is not surprising. But a lot of the time, the Korean people had maybe better pronunciation, or they had a lot of words they said from Korean that were like, oh, it sounds like this, it's the same one, and so did
Exactly.
Vietnamese people. So I guess you have that
Yes.
help as well.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. CJKV languages. If you know the one, if you know how to think about it and know like the root of where it comes from, you can recognize, oh, this means that. Yeah, there's a lot of cognates that you can immediately pick up through hearing, and other ones that you need to know the hanja, or the Chinese base
Oh, okay,
character, to be able to figure it out as well. But
cool.
that's definitely something that helps.
So when you started learning Japanese, what happened to your Korean? Did you find any drop in level or anything like that? I'm curious how that played out.
Actually, no. I think I had a strong enough base. Maybe I'd been learning Korean for about 5 or 6 or 7 years
Oh
before I
wow, okay.
started Japanese. Which is not to say I was fluent in Korean, but it was enough of a level to, use resources written in Korean. And that way I kept Korean alive while still learning Japanese.
Yeah. I mean, I try to stay away from that word altogether now. I think fluent,
Stay away from what?
fluent, the fluent word,
Oh,
because
oh gosh,
it's
that
so
is a
loaded. Yeah,
whole. It is, and
I
I don't.
recently took the word out my like because I used to call my website and channel like full time fluency, and I'm in the process of like taking it out from my tags and stuff now because I yeah
Really? But that's like how I know you. It's like your thing.
yeah I'm
What
thinking
are
of
you gonna
rebranding at
use to?
some point, but I've not decided yet. So anyway, that's a
Oh,
conversation for a different day. But
yeah.
so what were we talking about again? Oh right, you said you reached a high enough level. So when you were doing Japanese, you'd already studied Korean for 6 years, which obviously helps to have learned it to a decent enough level that it's kind of like cemented in your brain more, I guess. But when
Yeah.
you started after, did you do anything to keep your Korean going? Was it kind of just like all in on
So I was so
Japanese?
obsessed with Korean when I was that I had gone out of my way to make Korean friends and read Korean books and change my phone to Korean and have a lot of Korean music. And it was such a big part of my life that just by learning a new language, I there was no way that I could escape Korean
Mm-hmm.
because of its presence in my life, if that makes
It's just
sense.
kind of like there, yeah. Makes a
Yeah,
lot
and
of
I
sense.
think I was dating a Korean guy when I started learning Japanese. So I was actually in Korea seeing him when I heard the news that my parents are moving to Japan.
Mm-hmm.
So while I was going out with a Korean guy, my whole life kind of sort of shifted towards Japan. So I still had like this French brothers relationship with someone where I was speaking Korean every day, but outside of that, I was able to start learning Japanese. So the two really never clashed.
Oh wow, because I guess for me, I went to Taiwan and I had like a few of my girlfriends from Hong Kong and I have like a few other friends from Hong Kong and Cantonese was a big part of my life, still is a big part of my life now.
Yeah.
But when I was in Taiwan, I was kind of just like, that whole year just in like a Mandarin bubble, and I kind of just went like 100%, trying to get rid of everything that's not Mandarin, and then I kind of went
Yeah.
the best part of a year without really listening to or speaking anything, and I found that like when I got back at the end of the year, my listening has probably um been influenced a lot less than my output. But when I try to
Mm.
speak, I'm just like I say a Mandarin word, I'm like, wait, no, wait, how do I say that in Cantonese? And
Ah.
they're so similar. A lot of the time, it's exactly the same character, just the pronunciation slightly different.
Mm.
But because I spoke Cantonese first and I started speaking Mandarin quite early, when I speak Mandarin, I have a lot of bad pronunciation habits from Cantonese that I still say odd things with Cantonese pronunciation.
Interesting.
So they've kind of just like influenced each other quite badly. Um,
Yeah, that's a tough one. Maybe it's even harder with Mandarin and Cantonese. I'm not extremely familiar with Cantonese, but I believe you can essentially have the same sentence written in Mandarin and just swap it out and read it in Cantonese in the sense that like the sentence structure is the same. Whereas with Japanese and Korean, because the sentence structure is different, you might struggle with pronunciation or
mhm.
something, but there's a more of a distinction than I think Mandarin and Cantonese would
Yeah.
have.
I guess it depends if you're talking about written or formal Cantonese and
Oh,
like
right.
colloquial spoken Cantonese. So
Oh, then that's different.
if
Yeah.
you had a sentence in Mandarin, it would be like 你是不是中国人? And if you said that in
Mm.
Cantonese, it's like 是不是中国人? And it's
Oh,
that
exactly. Yeah.
是不是 is 是不是. But
Yeah. Yeah.
if you were actually speaking, you'd say 嗨, which is like a different thing. So it's kind of like the Japanese hi is to be in Cantonese, and
Mm,
it's the character 关系的系 and it uses
Oh,
that
yeah.
character
Yeah.
for it. So you
Yeah.
can write down Cantonese as it's spoken. It's normally spoken a bit different, but in general, the overlapping vocabulary is like most of it overlaps, I think, and it tends to be the most common things like the, shi, bu, stuff like that. Like the most common characters in Mandarin are the
Mhm.
ones that swapped out, and a lot of the other ones are like exactly the same,
Mhm.
And the more technical you go, the bigger the overlap, because you're not gonna if you get a really technical term, I don't know, like something sciencey, is not going to be different in one than the other because it's just like the
Yeah.
one word for it. Yeah.
True. True. I find that with like CJKV languages as well. I guess you could look at
So
it as like technical
CVKG. What?
CJKV. So Chinese, Japanese, Korean,
Oh,
Vietnamese.
okay.
Those languages. Those kind of like I don't know if technical terms are the right words, but words like museum is so the same in all of the languages, or education or school. Those kinds of words tend to be very, very
Yeah.
similar.
Yeah. When I went to Japan, I saw the sign saying like museum that way, and I think the characters were the same as Chinese,
Yeah,
like the park and
exactly.
stuff.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you didn't actually have that much of a problem. So I guess, did you ever go back to Korean? So how long did you study Japanese for? And then did you go to a point when you stopped studying Japanese intensively and went back to Korean?
Yes, and I think those were kind of pushed by external factors being language exams. I did want to get my JLPT and my topic Korean exam certificate. So I took the JLPT in December 2018. Was my book for that.
Which one was
And
that, sorry?
when I was, sorry?
Which one was that, sorry? Which level?
JLPT N3. Yeah, that
Uh-huh.
was in 2018. N3? Yes, N3. And I focused all my efforts on that. I didn't even touch any other languages.
Mhm.
And when I moved to Singapore, has it? I think I said 2 years earlier, but I can't remember when I came. 2019. Has it? Yeah, I came here in February 2019.
Okay.
And we're in
Yeah.
2020 now. Yes, it's been a year. Sorry, I'm so dyslexic with numbers, but I took the topic this year, and I hadn't really studied Korean at all since then. I had just kept it in maintenance mode, but when I was preparing for the topic this year, it was full on focus study on Korean mode. So
Hmm.
I feel like my languages kind of go in like little hotspots of each language
Yeah.
on a different timeline. It's really, it shuffles.
I guess there's two things I wanted to ask. I guess the first one would be, what do you do when something's in maintenance mode to not let it slip too much? And I guess the second thing would be when you switch between. I think I heard you in another video. I think it was you said something like, when I studied hardcore Japanese, I speak Korean with a Japanese accent. And when I study hardcore Korean, I speak
Yeah,
Korean with a Japanese accent.
it's the
So
worst.
yeah, I'll just
I'm sorry.
talk
I
a bit about
didn't. I
that.
didn't hear your first question. You spoke a
Oh,
bit fast. Could you repeat your first question?
what does it mean when a language is in maintenance mode?
Oh, okay. Yeah. I'll start there. So for me, maintenance mode, how I define it is you've gotten to a point where the language is at least at an intermediate or upper intermediate level,
Mhm.
and you are fine to just leave it be, and then you can study another language freely, and you will not lose that language actively. So I started learning Hungarian, and I was about 2 or 3 months into it when I shifted my focus completely to Mandarin Chinese. That was around 2018.
Mhm.
And Hungarian was not at a level where it could be maintenance mode. By maintenance, I mean passive stuff like listening to a podcast and just keeping the language alive without actively studying it.
So would you
My
try to do
Hungarian,
like something small? Would you try to do something small like that every single day, or would it just?
yes, or a few times a week at least. Yeah.
Mhm.
So for me, it might just be listening to a podcast or calling a friend or watching a movie. And that's enough to be like, oh, I can
Yeah.
still understand this language. I'm good. But definitely that's only when your language is intermediate or advanced. My Hungarian was so basic that whatever I learned in those 2 or 3 months, I almost completely forgot all of that until this year when I restarted learning Hungarian. And it's very frustrating because you're like, oh man, I put all this time in and um, well, all that time, I mean like 2 or 3 months, and
Mhm.
it's all gone to waste because I did not reach a level high enough to keep it in maintenance mode for me to explore other languages.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I
And your
think
second question?
I think I was hearing about your experience with how like Japanese and Korean influence each other. And you said, you study one and you end up speaking with
Oh,
like the other
yeah.
one's accent. And I don't
Oh
know
my
what
gosh.
your experience was with that.
I think in general, maybe a lot of us in the language community, our ears are so sensitive and accents are so fluctuating. I've met people who are native English speakers, and just by learning other languages, the way they speak English, the way they pronounce English, their own language changes a bit.
Mm.
So I think maybe that's just who we are as people, that accents are so fluctuating or fluid. But I have noticed if my ears are exposed to Japanese a lot more, when I speak Korean, I get a little bit of a Japanese twang or vice versa, and it's very frustrating. But it just kind of helps me realize like I'm human, I'm still learning, and
Hmm.
it happens with every language. It's fascinating actually.
Yeah. Even with my like English, I started saying stuff like when I was in Taiwan, my friend was like, "Oh, what are you doing?" I'm like, "Oh, I just need to go and like write my homework." And in English, you normally say, "I need to go and
Uh,
do my homework," but I always said, "I need to go and write my homework," because I had like the thing in my head from Chinese, I guess, and it was just loads of like little things like that would just kind of come out, and I'd be like, "Wait, that's not
uh,
correct. What did I just say that?"
yeah,
So
I
I
have
can
that with
definitely
eat
relate.
medicine. I forget to say take medicine. I always say eat medicine because that's what you say in Korean.
And it just sounds like a bit strange almost to the ear in
Yeah,
English, but yeah.
yeah. Uh-huh.
Well, it's really interesting. So what are your plans going forward then, do you
I
think?
would like to not lose what I've learned in Japanese and Chinese. So
Mhm.
definitely continuing on those. But I'm very keen to explore a few baby languages. So nothing new that I haven't touched on before, but advance my Hungarian and Vietnamese and Tagalog as well. So just trying to see
Oh,
if I
wow.
can get those a bit off the ground.
Busy times, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. How do you manage to fit languages into your life? Is it what do you do full time actually?
So full time I work as a chemical engineer.
Oh wow.
And normally I try to get up early in the morning every day and read in the morning because that's when I have the most energy. And then whatever my playtime is, like watching TV or games or whatever, I just try to do as much of that in the target language as possible.
Hmm.
So, for example, I just finished watching a drama about the Bruce Lee's life. It was a Mandarin drama on Netflix called The Legend of Bruce Lee about his life from growing up in Hong Kong, getting into fights, becoming like a martial arts champion in America, and then also later on shooting films and his tragic death at the end. But then now I've started watching some other drama to do with it's called the King's Wars, the English name, which doesn't tell you a lot about it. But if you hear the Chinese name is Chu Han Chuanqi, and it's like the Chu dynasty and the Han dynasty. So it's
Ah,
sorry, not the Chu's like Chu's not the dynasty. It's a six bit part in China. And it's after the Qin dynasty, there was like a war between those three states, between
okay.
Qin, Chu, and Han, and then the emperor and Qin died, and then there was a big war between the Chu and the Han after, which gave rise to the Han dynasty, which is why they refer to themselves as the Han Chinese today, because that had such a big influence. It's when like paper was invented and stuff like that. So that was like it's about that kind of period, and I'm just watching a drama into that, and I, I absolutely loving it at the moment, and yeah, it's just watching a lot of Netflix at the moment, I guess mostly.
Yeah. It's good to keep the language fun. It's mentally exhausting to just sit and study from a book every single day, and you really do learn a lot just from listening and watching for sure.
Mhm. I haven't actually studied in a very long time, really. I don't. I tend to try and go more on the side of just getting a lot of input, but I think
Oh yeah.
now I'm probably going to be going back into study mode a little bit because I just started dabbling a little bit in classical Chinese. So I've got like a textbook with that, and it has like all sorts of like chapters
Wow.
and like things that are to do with right into history and things like that. So it looks really, really cool. So I'm
Oh,
starting to dabble a little bit into
very
that.
cool. Okay,
And
wow.
yeah, but yeah, it seems quite difficult. So we'll see.
I don't think I would ever attempt that. I take my hat off for you.
Cool. Well, yeah, thank you very much for coming on. I guess it's more or less time for you now. Is there anything you want to say before we wrap this up?
No, just thank you so much for having me, and it's always exciting to talk to fellow language learners. And if anything, to people who are watching, don't be afraid of just exploring different methods for learning languages. There's really no wrong or right answer.
Mhm.
It's clear that you and I, for instance, have different methods and different interests, but we're both enjoying the language in our own way, and I think that's what's really important.
Cool, cool. Yeah, and thank you so much for coming on and doing this interview. So, and thanks everyone so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.
Thank
Cheers.
you.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks so much.